Today we're going to be looking at the tribe of Asher. Asher would be Leah's son. If you remember, Rachel and Leah are the sisters, and then there were also children by the handmaids of each sister, Zilpah and Bilhah. And Asher is born to Leah. Asher's name means happy. And to get a good grasp of Asher's family record, you can turn there, if you like, with me to 1 Chronicles 7 and verse 30. And we will probably come back to this repeatedly because there are some things in here that bring great clarity to this tribe. So 1 Chronicles 7 and verse 30. And while you're turning there, let me just say there are a lot of folks still scratching their head trying to figure out how is it possible to trace these biblical people? And I've said to you before, very easily. Many of these people, generations down the road, will tell stories that are very reminiscent of the Bible. They're perverted because it's like broken telephone through time. But they will either tell stories that greatly resemble the Bible, or they will have trace relatives that they say, I am descendant of so-and-so, which we trace back to some of these clans and tribes. So right where the Bible, basically, where these people are dumped into buffer zones, we have new people in a very short period of time reemerge under different names. And some of those names were given by the Assyrians. Some of those names were given by, depending on where these people were deposited, in what areas they were deposited in, they would have been called something by somebody else, and that name would eventually become kind of like it would stick to them, and they'd be known by this name, no longer the tribe of thus and so. So, 1 Chronicles 7 and verse 30, the sons of Asher, Imnah and Isua and Ishui, and Beriah, and this is an oddity, and Sarah, their sister. And that is an oddity. We seldom read of a female in the genealogies. I can't tell you that there's a specific reason why she's named here. It's just an oddity because for the most part we're looking at male descendants alone, all right? And the sons of Beriah, this is very important. I want you to pay attention to this. The sons of Beriah, Heber and Malchiel, who is the father of Birzvith, and Heber begat Japhlet and Shomer and Hathan and Shua and their sister, again another mention, very interesting, the sons of Japhlet. And if you just keep reading, you've got really a very good sense. When you've got all of these descendants like this, we're now kind of getting into the understanding of the tribe of Asher, and many of these descendants will become tribal, and their names will morph a little bit, but they will be a tribe of, the tribe of Asher, but clan, and their clan name may actually overtake their tribal name eventually. So just as a sidebar. So if you read through all that, and then verse 40 says, and all these were the children of Asher, heads of their father's house, choice and mighty men of valor, chief of the princes, and the number throughout the genealogy of them that were apt to the war and to battle was 26,000 men. Now that's the record here. If you go to the record in Numbers 1, which is the first census, don't turn there, but it's the first census taken after they come out of Egypt, you find the number of the total fighting individuals of the tribe of Asher is 41,500. And there's a little sidebar to this, because if you know how they were around the tabernacle, think of it as a cross or a plus sign, and that's how they were encamped. Kind of interesting that Asher would make up a component of what I would call the rear guard. So if you look at the way they were set up, you might say, well, whoever they were camping with or close to, they might have also been influenced by. And I'll explain what I mean by that, because Asher had a close proximity to Dan in terms of the encampment, in their placement. So Is it possible that, for example, I've said to you, Dan, we know there was an exodus of Dan before they went into bondage. Is it possible that Asher had a similar situation or circumstance? We're going to ask or probe that question in a minute. If you comb the record, you have a second census that's taken. So the first one out of Egypt is 41,500. The second one is 53,400. So that tells you they were doing their yab, they were multiplying, all right? Keeping busy while they weren't sacrificing animals and killing giants, right? All right, never mind. But what's interesting is by the time you get to 1 Chronicles, the number of fighting men has dropped dramatically, 26,000 fighting men in 1 Chronicles. So that's kind of a note of interest. It tells you that in your own time, I don't have the time, you may want to read if something happened to the tribe of Asher, and you have to comb the record and do a little bit of homework. I'm not going to do it for you. But some of you may be familiar, if you studied Hebrew with me or if you watched me do any type of Hebrew translation, you may have heard me mention the name Marcus Jastrow. And Marcus Jastrow wrote that it's really probably the most exhaustive Hebrew Aramaic. It's a form of a dictionary, I guess. It's just intense, all right? But he is perhaps one of the most prolific Talmudic scholars. And he made the connection that Asher's family, he proposed this, and I actually am in agreement with him on this, that in the ancient Egyptian inscriptions known as the Amarna tablets, there is a person named Heber. We just read that name, Heber. That was in verse 31, 1 Chronicles 7 and 31, Heber. He's saying that that clan is the same as the Chaberi clan found in the Amarna letters, also linking these to another people side by side called the Milkili people. So he makes the connection, and I actually agree with him. So this may have root in something else, because the Chaberi were also synonymous with the Habiru, the Hebrews. And we've got this name Hebrew right there. Now, I want you to think about this, because we're going to encounter this, so I might as well just say it now. Heber here is the same as Eber in Genesis that we looked at earlier when we talk about people who say, for example, those people before Egypt's bondage, for example, were they Hebrews? Yes. But they were not Jews. And you can't even say that they were Israelites because that didn't exist yet. So these are important things. A lot of people miss this and they just gloss right over it. So why is this important? Because we're going to encounter some places that these people travel to where you've got the Hebrew name included in a name. And it's hard to, at this point, it's hard to tell, was that given from the Genesis record, or is this named after a descendant out of this family? So we'll try and figure that out. I don't know if we'll be able to. For this congregation, if you've been around any amount of time and listened to the teaching here, you are no stranger to the Song of Asher in Deuteronomy 33. Now, most of you who will be familiar with this, you probably are familiar with what we call the nitro pill aspect of Deuteronomy 33, which is what? As thy days, so shall thy strength be. Ooh, we even had repetition there. Yay. Okay? But pay close attention, because this is Moses doing kind of a little bit of what Jacob did. But if you read carefully, starting at verse 24, end of Asher, he said, let Asher be blessed with children. Let him be acceptable to his brethren, and let him dip his foot in oil. And then, of course, that very strange and often misconstrued, thy shoes shall be iron and brass, as thy days, so shall thy strength be. There is none like unto the God of Jeshurun, who rideth upon the heaven in thy help and excellency in the sky. The eternal God is thy refuge, and underneath are the everlasting arms. And he shall thrust out the enemy from before thee, and shall say, destroy them. That is all part of the Song of Asher. Now, we've seen that as a nitro pill, but I'm asking you to consider something very interesting that I will, once I've laid the foundation, I'll ask you if you can make even a small connection to this, because we've often said, shoes of iron and brass. You know, you can take that as how it's been taught here, tough shoes for a tough trip, and that's a wonderful faith message. But maybe there may be some other message in there too that may have a double meaning, and we'll see if we can pull that out of here. What do we know about this tribe? Well, if you start looking at the land allotment, this is all background, so you've got to lay the foundation so that we're able to see what happened here. So starting in Joshua 19, we have the land allotment, and I ask you to pay it. You know, sometimes reading these things is kind of tedious, but there's some hard points in here I ask you to consider and take note of. So Asher's portion, which is Joshua 19, beginning at verse 24, and the fifth lot came out of the tribe of the children of Asher according to their families, and their border was Helkath and Hali, Betin and Asheph, and Elamelech, Amad, Mishel, and reacheth to Carmel westward, and to Shehor Libnath, and turneth towards the sun rising, the Beth Dagon, and reacheth to Zebulun, and to the valley of Jipthael toward the north side of Beth Emek, and Neiel, that goeth out to Kabul on the left hand, Hebron, Rehob, Hamon, Cana, and even unto great Sidon. That is Sidon. Very important. And why do I say that? Because read, then the coast turneth to Ramoth and the strong city of Tyre. Now, what's very bizarre is your margin will read Sur, if you have a Bible like mine, but it should be Sidon and Tyre. And I'm pointing this out for a reason. This is the inheritance of the tribe of the children of Asher according to their families, these cities with their villages. So I want you to put in perspective that their land assignment would touch the very edge of Sidon and would touch the very edge of Tyre. And that is very insightful. Why? Because we know that that area was controlled either completely by Canaanite or by Phoenician. And so what makes that important? Remember I told you, anytime you have a border with people who weren't part of this group, you would most likely have an exchange of ideas. You may even have an exchange of potential mates. That means foreign marriages, trade, all kinds of things that we don't tend to think of. We think, oh, they got a land allotment. They must have put a fence there and built a wall and protected themselves. No, it didn't work like that. So I want you to imagine that where they are buttressed up against is right up against Phoenician and Canaanite territory, which tells me that they would have had exposure to these people, to these other people. And if you remember, I addressed this when I talked about Dan, because there's no doubt in my mind that there was exchange of information, of technology. We don't read the Bible and tend to think technology, but I want you to think these people who were not, for example, boat makers, managed to build seafaring vessels that could withstand really bad storms. And do you think they did it by trial and error? Like, oh, let's build a raft. Oh, that didn't work. 50 people drowned. I don't think they did it like that. I think they observed their neighbors with all of their skill and all of their technology and whatever they knew to do and replicated or even asked for their help. It's completely plausible. So this is why the location of Asher's territory is very important. Then you read just a couple of pages later, you'll read in chapter 21 and verse 6. This is kind of interesting. It mentions the sons of Gershon that received 13 cities from the tribe of Asher, as well as Issachar, Naphtali, and the half-tribe of Manasseh east of the Jordan. Verse 6, the children of Gershon had by lot, out of the families of the tribe of Issachar, and out of the tribe of Asher, and out of the tribe of Naphtali, and out of the half-tribe of Manasseh and Bashan, 13 cities. So what we know, and this is what's interesting, just turn a couple of pages to the first chapter of Judges. We've been here before, so forgive the repetition. But in Judges chapter 1 and verse 31 and 32, remember God said, drive the people who are inhabiting the land, drive them out, get rid of them. Well, verse 31, Judges 1, verse 31, neither did Asher drive out the inhabitants of Echo, nor the inhabitants of Sidon, nor of Ehlab, or of Achzib, or of Hebla, or Helba, nor of Aphik, nor of Rehob. But the Asherites dwelt among the Canaanites, the inhabitants of the land, for they did not drive them out. I've already addressed this before, but it's noteworthy to say. God said, the land will be yours if you do thus and so. And I don't think anybody really successfully did what they were supposed to do here, so let's not just isolate one tribe. But the important thing that I'm pointing out is don't be surprised after all this time. Remember, put this in perspective. They have already, all of the children of Israel collectively, have already grumbled and complained, which caused them to wander in the desert for 40 years. Do you really think it would take 40 years to get to the promised land? So that's God's way of saying that's your reward for being such stiff-necked, complaining, obtuse people, okay? That was their punishment, 40 years wandering in the desert. And then we have, when they finally at least get to where they're supposed to be, then they build the golden calf. They're all responsible. It wasn't just one tribe, one person. They all participated. So when you get to this place where God says, drive out your enemies, you'd think they'd say, yes, sir, right? Because at least check one box. Do one thing that God said. No. And the consequences, I've read them already to you. You can go back and read in Deuteronomy, the blessings and curses that Moses gave, and the whole Bible speaks of the same thing. Failure to do what God basically told them, instructed them to do, produced some very dire consequences. The reason why God said, I want you to drive out the enemies and the people, the foreigners in the land, there was one primary goal. God knew if they eradicated and got rid of those people, they would not be influenced by pagan religion, by pagan practices. They would not have interest to intermarry with other people outside of their tribe or outside of their realm. But that's exactly what happened. So it's kind of a no-brainer when you start to look at how everything just goes downhill, and suddenly most of these people are steeped in idolatry, pagan worship, and they're intermarrying, just exactly what God said to not do. So kind of an interesting thing. Then if you turn just a few pages more to Judges 5, and we've already looked at this passage. Here we have the call of Deborah, who is the judge at this time, and it's a call for all of the tribes to help fight off in a situation, we'll call it, that needed every able body. And if you remember, down there we're looking at verse 17. Gilead abode in Jordan. Why did Dan remain in ships? Asher continued on the seashore and abode in his breaches. Now, in a previous message, I pointed this out. Why did Dan remain in his ships? I think Dan was saying, we out of here, okay? That's what I think they were saying. No, we're not helping. We're done. We're out of here. But Asher, very interesting. The Swedish Bible, I wish I had brought it with me, but the Swedish Bible, the word for breach is right there. In the Swedish version of this passage is vik, V-I-K, sometimes V-I-G, but V-I-K, which is where most scholars, including myself, believe that the word Viking comes from, this particular passage in the Swedish Bible. That being said, it's very interesting. Remember I said to you that these people would be heavily influenced in the territory where they live if they have influences from Canaanite and from Phoenician counterparts, if you will. There's no doubt in my mind that both Dan and Asher, and possibly some others, but certainly these that were living close to these coastal cities, would have been influenced by these seafaring people who were experts. They perfected the art of seafaring and sea commerce, and if you really want to go the whole 9 yards, it's the Phoenicians that paved the way, opening up that whole area from the coastal line, we'll call it of the Levant or the Holy Land. If you're going outward, Turkey, Greece, there were places along the way of commerce and trade that they established that then become kind of like a known freeway, except it's on water. They established a lot of this, which paves the way for these tribes, those that will be traveling after Egypt's bondage, paves the way for them to migrate by sea very easily, because now it's well established. They're not entering into lands or sea that have not been traversed before. So this is an important sidebar. Now, sorry to make you turn back and forth here, but if you go back to 1 Chronicles, and I want you to look at something there that I think is rather interesting in the 12th chapter, because this is all kind of foundation and background for what we'll be looking at. In the 12th chapter, 1 Chronicles, verse 36, we have here David is calling men to war. He's calling them into his army. And most of the tribes are present here. Verse 36 says, "And of Asher, such as went forth to battle, expert in war, 40,000. And that's kind of an important piece of information, because this is the largest amount of fighting men, only second to the tribe of Zebulun when it comes to David's personal army. Equally, and I won't make you turn there, but in 1 Kings 4 it shows an official from the tribe of Asher, the son of Hushai. So if you know the story, Hushai agrees to go over and pretend to serve Absalom. And this is why Hushai is called David's friend, because we know what Absalom was. What's sad is later in the later history, we read of Solomon giving away 20 cities of Asher to the king of Hiram, basically as a trade and reward for his help and participation. And King Hiram did not respect the land that was given. He thought it was not of any value. So can you imagine that, having your land taken away and given to someone who doesn't even respect it, saying, oh, that's trash, that's garbage. That probably must have been a real dig to this tribe of Asher, even maybe bringing on some anger. Why did this happen? But we know something interesting. When the kingdom split, we have Asher staying to the north. That was their assigned territory, but I want to make a point about this. Even though that was their land allotment to the north, because of their allegiance to David, it would have been very easy for them to have stayed in the south, outside of their land. Remember, they're serving David. They would then eventually possibly go on to serve Solomon in the same capacity. So you could make a case and say, when the kingdom split, they could have verily said, no, we will stay on the side of the southern border, because that is essentially the epicenter where all things that were relevant both to David and Solomon were. But they chose to go and stay in their own territory. And I think the amazing thing about that is that God knew this was his plan. I mean, God has used many people to accomplish his bidding. You know, we've seen the Chaldeans, the Assyrians, the Babylonians. So it's all part of the plan for them to basically stay in their territory. Now, here's what I was trying to point out. You remember we looked at in 1 Chronicles 7, one of the descendants' name is Heber, right? You remember that? We just looked at it. So here's what's bizarre. One part of a Phoenician colony was called the Heberides, or the Hyborides. I'm not sure how you want to pronounce that, but right there is Heber right there. The question is, was this named after Heber of Genesis, or is this named after a descendant of the tribe of Asher? Now, I'd lean heavily towards the Heber of Genesis, making it an earlier time, but we can't know that. There's no way to know. What we do know is it's named after one of these two, so it's good enough for me to kind of see there's a connection there. And of course, there is a connection when we talk about nomenclature. Why? Because we've got these areas, Heber, Iberia, Hebrides. So William Camden, the British historian and chronicler, wrote in his work entitled Britannia, "The merchants of Asher worked the mines at Cornwall, not as slaves, but as masters and exporters." This really got my attention. And remember, I said this to you before, we tend to think of the tribes as kind of these lesser educated people, not advanced in understanding or technology. It's not so. That is a complete error. What is important is the fact that this William Camden chronicles this, that they worked in the mines not as slaves but basically as masters and owners, tells you they had to have had a connection undisputedly to the Phoenicians, because this mining at Cornwall, we know really the inception of it began with the Phoenicians. That's why I said to you, pay close attention to where their land bordered on. They had to have heavy influences from these people. But that begs another question. If they were merchants in the mines, tin, metal, it begs me to ask, when Moses said, shoes of iron and brass, is there a double meaning there? And I'm not saying there is. I'm just saying it's something to kind of noodle in your mind, because, you know, Moses could have said, you're just going to have a tough trip. The colloquial version, it's going to be tough, your life's going to be difficult. But iron and brass, and then there's the other difficult thing for me to wrap my mind around, which is brass. And I'm not really quite sure what age that fits into. But iron, we know what period that fits into. So then there's another question you have to ask yourself, which we can entertain at another time. Was that a prophetic foretelling? I don't know. But we do know by the time of the Assyrian deportation that some of the tribe of Asher was known by the Assyrians, referred to as Issedones, Issedones, also sometimes referred to as AS, and also as Assi, Asii. We get those names from some of the scant writing available to us in the secular realm in antiquity, not modern scholarship, okay? Most assuredly, we also have people coming out of this tribe that will be known as the Aorsi, the Asir, and the Assurs. Good enough breadcrumbs right now with all of these names that if you kind of do a little bit of investigating and if you were kind of probing, you would see these people went in many different directions. So we have some of them living east of the Black Sea, and it's recorded by several writers of antiquity that the chief ruler bearing the name from this clan, Odin, which we'll have to come back to, there's not enough room to talk about this here, but Odin moved his people into the northern part of Europe so as to not have to deal with the heavy hand of the Roman Empire. That's, of course, at a later time, but you get the idea. Once you start seeing east of the Black Sea, you'd say, well, were they clustered with the Scythians? Well, that brings up an interesting question, because we have a swath of those people known as Scythian that will end up Norway, Normandy, and eventually in Iceland, hailing from the tribe of Asher, but clumped into the Scythian category. So something really that I don't know how we'll pick this apart. We may just have to do a whole focus on how the Scythians in their subgroups migrated, and that might give us better insight. But if you have been around this ministry, say 20, 30 years, if I say the word Latin or Hallstatt, you know what it is. For people that don't, please go and look that up. It's very important. Latin, 2 words, L-A, and then ten, T-E-N-E, and Hallstatt. These are 2 areas where we have a tremendous amount of remains, and now DNA has super helped us understand who these remains belong to, but a whole culture that flourished And we attach these people to a lot of the migratory patterns coming out of the area we're discussing. So kind of an important thing, but if you're not sure, please look it up. It's kind of very fascinating. There's lots of information online. But these people of the tribe of Asher will be known by another name, which you may have heard of, called the Vandals. Veneti, who were in Gaul, who were also called Pictones or Picts. And we can trace these people all the way into Northern Ireland, onto Wales. So now you're getting an idea. We have them east of the Black Sea. We have them migrating the same pattern as most of the other tribes that left by water. But what's interesting is how they actually will start fanning out and end up in other places that you'd say, how can that be? So hold on, because this might take a little weird turn for a minute. Now, you remember we were looking at Judges 5, and I pointed out to you that term, breaches for Asher, belonging to and connecting to the term Viking. We can also know that the son of Asher, Beriah, remember Hebrew, Bet or Vet. If you're looking at the Hebrew language, sometimes we cannot know if there are no diacritical marks. We can't know if it's a B or a V. So I want you to think that Beriah could have been Veriah. And why that's important, because we also are going to know these people who are descendants of Beriah, biblical Beriah, as Veriah or Veragu. They are his descendants. We can trace them definitively. That's what's so amazing. This tribe, actually, more than most, we can trace the clans and we can see the close association with morphed names that may have, I don't want to say anglicized because there was no English yet, but morphed into close enough sounding names that you can say, well, one might be, wow, quite a coincidence. But when all of the sons have counterpart names, you have to say there's a little bit more than coincidence going on. So we have these names having strong ties to the Vikings and those that would inhabit a swath of Russia. Wow, so we're talking about a huge fan in many directions here. We'll also find, if you remember, I mentioned Malkiel as one of the sons. We will find them as a definitive group among the Scythian people. Now, if you're listening to all this for the first time, please go back and listen to some other previous messages, and this might make more sense. I'm fearful of losing some of the newer listeners here, but it's important, if you are not caught up with me and you haven't been following, to kind of follow up on this, because it becomes eye-opening. At first I have people saying, well, what do I care about the Vandals and the Goths and the Picts, and what do I care about this? Well, you start to understand who these people, where they came from, northern tribes of Israel. By the way, let me just put in here, not Jewish people, okay? Northern tribes, the Bible even says they will forget their traditions, they will forget their God, they will forget a lot of things. And they will go on to be scattered throughout the world. So if you're ever wondering, where did these people go? And this is the danger of the internet. If you go on the internet and you look up lost tribes, you will find, I'm sorry, I mean no disrespect, but I'm just going to say it so you can avoid the pitfalls. You will find all kinds of people being referred to as lost tribes. There are people who actually, in villages in different parts of the world, claim that they are part of some tribe. But if you look long and hard, there's some real big disconnects, okay? We're following a trail. We're following breadcrumbs. In some cases, we're following DNA and archaeological evidence. We're not following somebody's, my great-great-great-great-great-grandmother or grandfather was. That don't work for me, okay? Because there's a lot of people that claim to be lost, and they are, but they are not lost tribes, okay? They are not. So let's just be, this is important though, because remember what I said to you. Identifying who these northern tribes are as they've been spread out and scattered, just as God prophesied through the prophet Hosea, lets us have an indicator when we study prophecies that have been fulfilled. Let's call it modern time prophecy. say the last 200 years. We can identify people if we know who they are. We can identify them by reading the Bible if you don't know the terminology of, for example, I've said many times, before I started teaching on this, many of you have written me and said, well, I didn't understand when I was reading, oh, Ephraim, or what did that mean? Now you have a clearer understanding of who we're talking about. Ephraim's referring to the northern kingdom, the whole kingdom. Sometimes referring to Ephraim, the tribe itself, the descendants of Ephraim, but by and large, usually in the Bible, the mention of Ephraim is the northern tribes. Samaria, the northern tribes. Israel, biblical Israel, the northern tribes. So it's almost impossible, A, to study prophecy as in past fulfillment or current day events without knowing these people and who they are and what lands they belong to. Equally impossible to know if you're looking ahead and trying to figure out how will this all work out. God's got prophecies in this book telling us, for example, we know which country Antichrist will come out of. We know that already. That's in the Bible. And there's enough information about the false prophet. We have enough information about things leading to the end times that if we're crystal clear on who these people are, you will not make the mistake of misidentifying and saying, well, because I've heard all kinds of people say all kinds of things about future prophecy that's completely in error. Why? They didn't have the foundation and the background that we're doing right now. You need it. So if you're interested in understanding prophecy, this is not just a history lesson. I'm not talking about how the world was made or formed or how we got here, but really that, again, begs the question. Some of us think, I'm this nationality in my heritage. And some of you have had DNA testing, which I honestly don't recommend, okay? Not in this day and age because it's stored in a national database and probably will be used against you at a future time. And I'm a big believer in that. So, but if you've done it, too late, all right, it's already done, and you've all sucked your relatives into that same vortex, so don't worry about it. If you commit a crime, you're all going down, okay? Just don't worry about it. I'll pray for you. But, okay, so I guess the key thing, though, is we can know by DNA testing of things we find in the ground, of skeleton, of any bone, and even artifacts. We can have good evidence to point in the right direction to show and identify where did these people come from and their migratory patterns and where they ended up. And all of this becomes crystal clear. It's like taking a puzzle, dumping all the pieces out of the box. You can see what the picture looks like, but right now it's a big pile of pieces. That's all it is. But when you put all the pieces together and it matches the box, like us deconstructing and reconstructing, you can then put it back to see the big picture. You can better understand what God's plan is for the future. And that plan requires this type of study. So, as I said, it will bear fruit eventually in many ways. Okay, one of the larger clans of Asher, we read of the children. Let me turn back, they were just a few pages away. So one of the larger clans of Asher, if you are looking at 1 Chronicles 7 and verse 30, happens to be this first child, Imnah. And we know that the Imnah, or the clan of Imnah, became known as the Muan. I know that's so weird, but we know that, who are possibly the Manapee of Belgium, and also related to another name, the Omani, which is another name that you'll find within the genealogies. So it's kind of interesting when you start picking this apart, you can see how it all fits together. At some point, much later in history, this is a far stretch, but we know it to be true based on DNA and other evidences, that the tribe of Asher, some of its descendants, will be called Lugians. And these Lugians are the aforementioned Omani. Remember, I said to you, it's very interesting how people kind of migrate, and as they appear somewhere, they'll be called by the people watching them. They're referred to as a certain way, and usually that name takes hold and sticks, and they are referred to as such, or it's a tribal leader's name. But in this case, we're quite certain that this name was applied to them, and then it stuck. So we also have some other interesting correlations, as I said. So if you're in the same place as I am in 1 Chronicles 7 and 30, the people called Jimna or Imna become the Omani. The people called the Esua or the Isui become the people known as the Hesi. That's Heissi. And Beriah or Variah become the Boroi. But eventually all of these people become known under one banner as Vandals. So what about the Vandals? They sacked Rome in 455 AD. They went on to found a kingdom in North Africa. I'm giving you the synopsis because you got to go back to hear the weird stuff they did. Most records say that they were incredibly prosperous until they were conquered by the Byzantine Empire in 532 AD. I need to elaborate a little bit here. Most people, if you're reading history and of all the things I've told you about the Goths and other people who were labeled as barbarians, had a habit of invading, destroying, and killing. That's what they did. The Vandals did not. You'd think, surely they did. No, they didn't. They actually they were warring people, but they were also, if you can put your mind around this, they were respectful people. They did not do what all these other tribes did or all these other clans did. And according to Torsten Cumberland Jacobson, former curator of the Royal Danish Arsenal Museum, he points this out and shows in great deal, makes the point. I read all of his work and found it was very convincing enough to say, note to self, I get it, they were different. But to show you how unfair and unjust life is, every once in a while a word gets hijacked. And this word is no different. So their name, Vandals, it's around sometime after the French Revolution. A man named Henri Grégoire de Blois used the term vandalisme in French to denote before and after the French Revolution, the destruction, the complete, whatever they did to destroy artwork and pieces of, we'll call it national treasures that were out in the public eye. So that term is first used there, and then of course it takes root, and then most people would make the association that Vandals vandalize and the vandalism. No, they didn't. Unfortunately, their name got hijacked though, so that's pretty bad. Then there is a well-established fact by historians that by the 4th century, the use of the word Vandal was used to describe two Confederate separate bodies within their tribe, if you will, the Hasding and the Silling Vandals, and we encounter them at large in Sweden, okay? So I've painted a perspective here. They were east of the Black Sea, they were in Russia, they probably followed some Scythian migration, they also went by sea. We know that they ended up in Wales. So we've got a very big fan, we'll call it a huge spread on these people, not just one land. For example, like Dan, we know they ended up in Ireland, right? Not so with these people, they're kind of peppered everywhere. So we have very scant information left to us historically. Cassius Dio, the Roman writer, he wrote that the Vandals were led by two chief names. The names were Raus and Raptus. For some reason, I don't know that that could be true, but hey, he wrote it, and he was a historian, so we're going to assume it's true. Who made an incursion into Dacia, which is modern-day Romania. When I said they're all over the map, they are all over the map, right? If you listened last week, I mentioned the writer of antiquity, Jordanus. He claimed that the Vandals controlled much of the territory north of the Danube River and suffered a great loss multiple times over to the Goths. Another turn of event will happen for these Vandals, which is the coming of the Huns, who in 375 AD will drive all of these people out of the steppes where they were, the area that they were, the Eurasian steppes, and drive them towards the Roman Empire, which is not a good thing, by the way. That was not a good thing for the Vandals. The Vandals would go on to suffer many losses, and they would start moving towards Iberia in about 410 AD. And that, again, now you've got the connection back to Heber. Was Iberia named after Eber of Genesis or Eber of their clan? We can't say, but by 418 rather, the Vandals would suffer another loss of a people I mentioned last week, the Visigoths. So they're getting their butt kicked by everybody, all right? This is a history lesson. Okay, it's a great way to tell history. What'd you learn at church? They got their butt kicked. But eventually they had a huge win at what was Tarico, which is now Tarragona, Spain. So that tells you, when you think of, I want you to think of the map. They were everywhere fighting. They were so spread out that they had to be a very populous people. To wage warfare on all these different fronts, you have to have skill, you have to have weapons, and you've got to have numbers. And they evidently did. In 428, the Vandals would have a new leader that would take them to a very, very different land, North Africa. Boy. So God, are you telling me you're going to take all the tribe of Asher at the end of days? And good luck, because that's like finding the most remote places in the face of the earth, right? So kind of interesting, they again tried to lay siege to a place, Hippo, which was made famous by, if you know who Augustine is, Augustine was from Hippo, but they could not take the city. Somehow this odd battle ends with them signing a peace treaty with Rome, and they yielded today the land which is today Algeria and Morocco to these people. But of course, when you can't help yourself, you can't help yourself. So they themselves violated, the Vandals violated their own treaty. Go figure. And they took Carthage, which started another war. And remember, I told you Carthage would be an important city for us to look at some point, not now. Most of the Vandals would go on to become Christians, but not just any Christians. This is the sad part of this story. Most of the Vandals became Arian Christians. And now this takes me into a little bit of ecclesiastical history. So why is this so bad? You know, sometimes people have good intentions to want to preach the gospel, but they are just a little bit skewed in their theology, and that little bit of skewing can make all the difference in the world. And this one's pretty big, because Arius, although he obviously was a very powerful speaker, but he had such flawed theology, and one of the worst parts of his theology was that Jesus was created by God the Father and not co-equal. His understanding of the New Testament was so warped that, of course, he's eventually labeled a heretic, which I have to say makes sense, because Jesus was not inferior to the Father. The Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit make up a complete whole unit, all co-equal, having different roles. But as I said, it's very unfortunate, because most of these people succumbed to that theology, which led them down the pathway to be persecuted as heretics. So, you know, it's kind of a tough story here. You can't win any of this because you just can't make any headway here. But anyway, there's one more piece to the story that I want to add in. And that is, as I said, we know that the people to the north, for the most part, were all deported. But here's evidence, I have evidence, that we must have had somebody hide away somewhere. And it's my belief, it's my opinion. I always tell you when it's opinion. Most likely that this individual hid out in the south, and when they were deported into Babylon, might have been amongst those that returned because of what I'm about to tell you. So, go to the New Testament, Luke chapter 2. Okay. So here we are. Chapter 2 and verse 36. And there was one Anna, a prophetess, the daughter of Phanuel, of the tribe of Asher. She was of great age, had lived with a husband 7 years from her virginity. She was a widow of about 84 years, which departed not from the temple, but served God with fasting and prayers night and day. And she coming in, instant gave thanks likewise to the Lord, spake of him to all that looked for redemption in Jerusalem. And what's interesting is between her and Simeon, you've got kind of these bookends. But she's mentioned there, and you can see tribe of Asher. And I wanted to point that out to say somewhere, wherever she hid, wherever her, sorry, not her, but wherever her great-grandparents hid or were taken to Babylon, but they came back and obviously stuck with and stayed by the stuff in Jerusalem, because obviously here she is in the temple fasting and praying. So there are exceptions, random exceptions, but I point this out because this is of interest to me, that there was a remnant from this tribe by one named, a prophetess, by one named Anna, expressly spelled out. So that tells you that for whatever the reason, and I can't tell you that I know what it is, but for whatever the reason, God preserved a handful to keep certain concepts going. And why? Luke, we know Luke says, I set out to put all things in order, but he obviously includes this as some piece of information that most people just find random, and I find fascinating because she can identify with her tribe, with her clan, which is pretty fantastic. Most people in this day and age, they have a memory that is possibly back 2 generations at best. Here's someone who can identify their clan. So it does not surprise me that God, as much as these people have been scattered and fanned out from this tribe of Asher, does not surprise me that God will be able to identify who these people are and who exactly, when God calls his children at that final call. We know that the tribe of Asher is one included, by the way, in the gate and land apportionment at the end time. We know that they appear, they're present, they're not absent, they're not missing. So you tell me, what's a greater miracle? To be able to say that God foretold that the people would be scattered, and eventually one day, she is not the stick of Israel coming back. She is an exception, and there were exceptions. But that when God says he will reunite the north and the south again, one stick in one hand, which has not yet happened, tells me that God also has the ability to identify who are his, who were scattered, and where they went, even if it goes against everything we could possibly conceive of in our finite minds to think of how amazing it is that God has that power over his creation. It is vitally important that then we remember one thing. If you believe everything that I've said regarding these people, it makes it abundantly clear. Just take a look at what I've described. Look at what I've talked about the tribe of Dan. Look at what I've talked about so far. Most of these people from the north that get spread like seed, who do they become? Who do these people at large become? I'm not necessarily saying at this point in our lives, but clearly in history. Who do they become? Christians. Go figure that. So it's almost like God, God didn't say, oh, you all messed up, so now I'm going to come with a new plan and I'm going to send my son. Genesis 3:15 tells you that God had that plan at the beginning. So it makes perfect sense to me that God also had a plan for these people, that they wouldn't be void of faith. And yes, they turned away from their traditions and their customs and following the monotheistic God of Israel for a time. And when the time was right, as I've chronicled and looked, I told you about, for example, we know that the Catholics love to claim St. Patrick brought Christianity to Ireland. No, it was there before, and it didn't come under the nomenclature of a saint. Okay? That is the Catholic Church making their own history. There were preachers of the gospel there before, but it took God basically scattering the seed that would take root, that would become, as the Vandals became heretic Christians under the leadership of Arian teaching. Likewise, we've got, as I said, the tribe of Dan in Ireland. We've got the Reubenites to the north of France, and if you look very carefully, if you've ever you don't have to travel to France. All you have to do is go online and search out. There are churches literally everywhere you look. It's unfortunate because now the faith has declined so badly and there is a turning away from the faith, but that land is peppered with churches. So think about that. It's almost like God said, I'm going to scatter the seed that will take root, that will become the body. The body first that I send will be my son, but the body of Christ is the people who belong to the Lord. There they are. Here they are. So, I'm going to leave you with this thought. We serve a really amazing God, that all of this unfolding plan of redemption, it was no accident. You're no accident. And when you think about it, the grace of God that has brought us even to this day right here, for me to stand in front of you, for us to be all gathered here together. God has a plan, and I'll keep repeating this, although in this day and age it does not look like it. Stay by the stuff, this book, keep faithing and keep trusting God, and the rest of it, well, I think God's got the rest of it in His big plan already worked out. It's for us to stay faithful and looking unto Him who is the author and finisher of our faith. That's my message. I'm Pastor Melissa Scott, pastor of Faith Center, Glendale, California. I teach every Sunday morning at 11 a.m. If you'd like to attend services with us, simply call the 800 number, that is 800-338-3030, to join us. If you'd like to watch, listen, and learn 24 hours a day, simply log on to our website at www.pastormelissascott.com.